you were a part of the sport and also leading the sport of when it went from like a Southeast niche sport, some people didn't even acknowledge it as, to a national phenomenon. But what was there a race? Was there a moment where you're like, oh, hell, we got something pretty good here, boys?
Well, it to me, it's been all along. And my whole career is just nothing spectacular. I just happened to be at the right place at the right time. Like I was talking about the coverage of the sport, I was involved in the sport. My watershed moment was when I was at Atlanta Raceway. That it was, in those days, most tracks were independently owned. The France family had Daytona and Talladega, and then it grew from there. The Smith family had Charlotte, and it grew from there. But in the 70s and 80s, most of the facilities were all independent, and Atlanta was independent back then. The common owner was L.G. DeWitt that owned Rockingham. Him and his family owned all of Rockingham. He owned half of Atlanta, and then Walt Nix owned the other half. And in November of '85, I'm sitting there talking to Les Richter and Jim Hunter, and we were talking about, and they asked if I'd be interested in coming to work for the France family. And I said, because I'm looking at it as a young guy in the business, and the one family that made a living off of this sport every day when they got up and went to sleep at night was the France family. They didn't have any outside resources. It was all the sport itself. And a lot of the other independent ownerships had outside resources, and the racetrack was an opportunity to have fun at on the race weekends and everything. And I said, yeah, I would be. And so that kind of worked out. And then after we ran the All-Star race in May of '86, I went to work for the France family. But that decision at that moment to go to work for the France family was my opportunity that I look back at, and it was the smartest thing I ever did. And never looked back from that day on. And then you look through the sport and all the moments we had, whether it was the coverage, the expansion, the opportunities that we had to go into Chicago or Kansas City, Indianapolis, New Hampshire, different corners that we had the opportunity to grow in. That all came about at the time that, again, I was just lucky to be there and be part of that growth of the sport. As we go to those places, or Vegas or Miami, and Roger Penske puts Southern California back together after we lost the opportunities to race there. All that just kind of happened that all played a big part of growing the sport through that period.
So we've been around Ben Kennedy quite a bit. Corey raced with him in the East days, and just sitting back watching what he's doing with the rope that he's given. How important is it to you? You touched on working with the France family, working with Bill Jr., and being around them and bridging that gap to, Ben obviously didn't have the relationship with them that you do, and you're somebody that has been here through the heyday of everything and seen so many changes in the sport. How do you keep him, if he's the one that takes over, how do you keep him grounded with the fundamentals of the sport, but also, I guess, with the blinders off enough to move it to his generation? Yeah,
I think I give Ben most of the credit himself. He grew up around it, obviously, and could have gone in any direction. He could have done anything. His father was a dentist, plastic surgeon. His mother was involved heavily in the sport from her early years. He chose to be involved in the sport, whether it was some kid hawking souvenir magazines one weekend, and then he grew up enough to go off and do other things in the sport. He chose to do that. So that told you a lot right there when he decided that that's what he wanted to do. His style and his ability and his common sense all kind of comes together. But the strongest asset in him enjoying what he does in the sport and people watching him do it, and him convincing us old folks to maybe think a little bit out of the box, comes from his sincerity about wanting to be a player in the sport, and that's our fourth generation. But it's our first and two that actually sat in the wheel of a race car. So he he knows that. He knows what it's like to drive a race car. He knows what it's and to win races. He knows what it's like to work at a racetrack and understands the trials and tribulations. He still owns a race team, and so he knows the trial and tribulations of an ownership, even at the level that he does it at. And he brings all of that from the background into the office every day. And the sport benefits from that. The entire sport benefits, and the older he gets, the more it's going to benefit. And I don't think we had to teach him much because he's a good listener. He'll ask when he has something he needs help with. But him and Steve Phelps and Steve O'Donnell really gel well together. And his love and passion for what happens at the racetrack transferring to what happens behind the scenes is the greatest asset NASCAR can have going forward.
We already see some of the fruits of Ben Kennedy's labor, specifically with the LA Coliseum, the Clash race, temporary track there. 75th anniversary next year. We're going to a football field in LA, a street course in Chicago. We cover Bristol with dirt, right? The league is more flexible than it's ever been in terms of facilities we go to. So I want to ask you, how much more flexible can we be with potentially more temporary venues, international races in the future, from going from year 75 to year 85? Where's the direction of the sport go there?
I would tell you that it's open-ended. I don't think there's any limitations anymore. And I think what we're seeing in our sport, and it's tough for an older guy to look at it, or an older fan even, to look at it and say, what in the world are these guys doing? But when you do look at it through a modern lens and through the eyes of a Ben Kennedy and his generation, you get the fact that the world is like that today. The world is more instantaneous. The gaining knowledge is, I'd have to go to a library or borrow somebody's encyclopedia to look up something.
Do they even have libraries anymore?
They're not the same, I promise you. But today's world, I think the consumption of every type of, from shopping to entertainment, is different. And looking at it and Ben Kennedy has the ability to show us through his eyes what makes it different. And flexibility is one of the biggest things, and that's why I think it's open-ended.